This is Free to Exchange, a show where free-thinking scholars, free markets, and, ironically, free public television all meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. The Wild Wild West, cowboy movies and dime novels have led many people to believe that phrase epitomizes the chaos, disorder, and lawlessness that prevailed in the western United States in the 19th century. But my guests today are going to challenge that notion that the West was so wild and chaotic. My first guest is Dr. P.J. Hill. Dr. Hill is a professor emeritus of economics at Wheaton College and a senior fellow at the Property and Environment Research Center. He's also co-author of the book, The Not So Wild Wild West. He also happens to be a lifelong rancher from Montana, where his family started a ranch in 1894. PJ, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So let's start about the notion of the Wild West in general first. Mm-hmm. How accurate is this portrayal that people see? Are we getting a biased sample when we look and we see the Billy the Kid movies and Tombstone and things like that?
It makes great drama for novels and for movies, but it does not portray the West. Most of the time in the West, it was pretty orderly. And it was pretty orderly because, for instance, for one thing, interestingly enough, people were armed. And when they were armed, they decided that fighting each other turned out to waste a lot of resources. So you can look at mining camps, you can look at fur trappers, you can look at trailing cattle from Texas to the northern ranges. In all of those sorts of situations, what we would call institutional entrepreneurs. People figured out ways to solve problems, and they generally solved them in a way that lessened violence.
Well, so just in terms of the violence, there was violence, of course, but there was in the eastern United States too. Was it dramatically more pronounced in the West?
Murder rates in Abilene, Texas, or in Abilene, Kansas, one of the places where you'd think of cattle trailers coming in. The murder rates there were lower at that period of time with lots of people around and lots of armed people than they were in most eastern cities. And so that's just another place where we've kind of bought into this myth that there was lots of people killing each other, lots of gunfights in the streets. Most of the time people said, if we spend our time beating up on each other, that's going to use up valuable resources. And there's lots of things in the West, on the frontier, resources that can be used well, and so they wanted to use those resources well.
And of course, prior to being fully settled, it's a hard place to live. If you spend your time pillaging each other, it's not going to work out very well.
And the other interesting thing is, most of that time there was no large centralized coercive agent, what we would think of as a big state police force, an army, somebody to try to enforce the rights. So one of the fascinating things is that the rights were basically enforced by people on the ground that agreed to rules, most of the time informal rules, but they worked pretty well to solve these what we'd call collective action problems, or how we're going to come together to secure property rights.
I think this is an important point because, of course, the United States government, owned the West or had it under its jurisdiction. But you can write that on paper, but man, it's a big area. How do they effectively extend governance out there?
And as settlers moved west, the Euro-Americans moved west in advance of formal government. So eventually governments came into being, and there were territorial sorts of government. Texas, of course, was an independent nation.
We're well aware of it.
But those sorts of issues did not mean that there was much presence of government on the scene, at least kind of top-down coercive forces. And so most of the people had to figure out, how are we going to solve these sorts of problems just among us? And for instance, ranchers had the problem of lots of open range and grazing on that range. So how are you going to govern that? Because generally, if there's access to a resource and there's no great formal rules about who's going to have access to that resource, maybe people will overuse it. The ranchers came together pretty quickly and said, we're going to use the roundup as an exclusive method to exclude people. And you had to be a part of the roundup in order to ranch, because roundup was a joint productive activity that involved several ranchers. And if you tried to overgraze, they'd say you can't be a part of the roundup. And that was just a very useful way and it became actually organized into cattlemen's associations, and those cattlemen's associations enforced the rules, and they tried to reduce overgrazing, and they did a pretty effective job of it.
So give me an idea with the roundup then. It's a voluntary group of a few ranchers who come together. How do they monitor each other, and then how do they exclude each other?
Well, basically, there would be an agreement. There'd be several ranchers would come together, usually 10 to 12, that they had their own home base place, but there was a lot of open range that the cattle were running on. And they would just go around and say, you want to join the roundup? And then there would be a roundup, and a new rancher would come in, and they'd go visit him and say, look, part of what being here is being a part of the roundup. And if you're going to be a part of the roundup, you have quasi-rights to the open range. You can run a certain number of cattle on the open range. Interestingly enough, in North Dakota, not too far from my home ranch, Teddy Roosevelt bought a ranch. It had his home base property and some range on the open range, and Teddy announced that he was going to double the amount of cattle on the open range. A couple of ranchers showed up on his front step one day and said, "Mr. Roosevelt, you have the right to run 800 head of cattle. You don't have the right to run 1,600 cattle, and if you do that, you're not going to be a part of the community. We won't round up your cattle with you." Roundups were important twice a year, in the spring when they branded the calves, and then in the fall when they cut out cattle that were going to be trailed to market. And Roosevelt said, "Well, I guess if that's how we do it here, that's how I'll do it."
So you raised something important there. There's an economic incentive to get his cattle moved to market like this, but also you said not part of the community. There's an ostracism that would go along with that as well then.
Right, and that worked pretty well. Basically, as people came into the community, they understood that to be a productive member of that community, there was kind of moral suasion, if you will, but it was a very effective moral suasion. And so people were kind of read out of the community if you didn't obey the rules. And they did not depend upon the federal government, they did not depend upon state governments to enforce those sorts of rules.
All right, so that's how they provided governance where they were located. But there is also this kind of vision of the wild cattle drive, right? And then they get to Dodge City and all heck breaks loose there. And how about governance on that? How did those work?
That's an interesting case in which entrepreneurs are people that see ways to reorganize the world. We oftentimes think of entrepreneurs as finding a new technology or something like that. But interestingly enough, what I would call some of the important entrepreneurs, what are institutional entrepreneurs, people who come up with different rules, different ways of organizing. And trailing after the Civil War, there was a large surplus of cattle. During the Civil War time, Texas had been a very effective producer of cattle, so there was a big surplus, and there were the open northern ranges, so they had to figure out how to get the cattle north. You'd think that they might want to hire people to trail the cattle north. But there were a lot of risks. There were losses on the trails. They had to cross rivers. There was the danger of Indian predation. So it made sense to make the guy trailing the cattle the owner of the cattle. So he would basically, for the first 10 years of the cattle drives, they had to buy the cattle and then trail them north and then sell them to somebody else. And that was just so he could be the guy that had to monitor the risks. Then after a while the risks went down, and so they were just kind of hired agents to trail the cattle north. But that was just an effective way of organizing that sort of a regime. But again, not massive violence. Now, there were places along the trail that the cowboys could ride into after they'd been on the trail for a couple of months, and they might shoot their guns in the air, and they might go into the bars, and there might be a few fisticuffs. And so there was, you got young men, and they wanted to engage in some sort of recreation. And so from that comes the picture of the Wild West. But even in the bars, you had to be fairly orderly. You could fight people with your fists, but taking out a gun and shooting people was considered slightly outside the norm, and there was a sawed-off shotgun behind the bar, and the bartender was very willing to use it to say, "Out," if you're going to do that. And so basically,
take that outside.
Yeah, fight it outside. And even then, there were not massive numbers of gunfights. The gunfight at the OK Corral that may be historical in terms of a one-time event, but there weren't very many sorts of events like that.
Yeah, I mean, just like today when we watch movies about things, they're interesting precisely because they aren't the norm.
Right, that's right. And that's basically the case in most of the West. Most of the West was pretty orderly most of the time.
So let me ask you, we've got a few minutes left here about a different type of organization of, going well beyond the reach of where the state could protect them, is the settlers moving west, particularly all the way to California and doing the wagon trains. So they're not going to be under the protection of the government at all for either their internal affairs or the possibility of raids. Yeah. How did the entrepreneurs organize that?
They organized that with basically a constitution before they left. At the jumping off place, say St. Joseph, Missouri, they would gather together a group of people that wanted to cross together, and it made sense to not go across as a single entity. You probably wanted a group of people to go with you, and you'd hire a guide that would go with you. You put yourself under that person's command. You agreed that person could decide when you started and when you stopped. They actually even wrote into the rules, well, what will happen if we get partway across and we want to disband? Or when we get to California if we want to disband? And so those club rules, or constitutions, if you will, were pretty clear. They specified how you're going to organize life. and moving those people across the frontier. About 300,000 people between 1840 and 1860 went across the plains. That's a huge movement of people. Quite orderly, under fairly normal sorts of rules, that not a lot of violence in terms of one wagon train, trying to capture another wagon train. These were valuable resources that were out there on the plains, and there wasn't any government. So you'd think a wagon train might say, well, let's just take all the resources from this other wagon train. But it didn't happen very often. It was an orderly movement of people across an area that was fairly hostile to them.
Well, that's actually two separate questions of interest related to this. So why didn't you get conflicts between wagon trains? They obviously ran short on resources many times when they were crossing.
Right.
There's got to be a temptation without a government there to plunder somebody else.
Yeah.
What stopped them from plundering other wagon trains?
I'm not sure I have a great answer to that, except there did seem to be an ethos that you're going to be better off if you operate under a set of rules of what we would call property rights, and that they recognized that the people that had the other train had property rights. They also knew that other train would defend itself somewhat. They were all armed. And so that just meant that wagon trains that did that realized that they were going to be subject to all sorts of social sanctions. If they got to the California gold camps and they had stolen property, that was probably going to work against them too. Interestingly enough, the wagon trains actually accepted those sorts of rules. There was a murder on one wagon train, and on that wagon train they said, we really can't decide whether this was a justifiable homicide or not. They stopped another wagon train and said, we need a jury. And they said, other wagon trains said, well, it's going to be kind of expensive to stop for 2 or 3 days, but we really think we ought to. So we'll stop our wagon train, we'll impanel a jury from our wagon train to hear this conflict from the other one.
And the jury would be making its decision based on what they thought of as trail custom, probably,
right, yeah.
as opposed to formal law.
Very much.
Well, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Well, apparently there was quite a bit of the order in the not-so-wild, wild west. But what about vigilante groups? They wreaked havoc, or did they? We'll talk about them when we come back. Stick around.
Free to Exchange is a joint project of Texas Tech's Free Market Institute and Texas Tech Public Media. More information is available at fmi.ttu.edu.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Dr. Bruce Benson. Dr. Benson is the Templeton Visiting Scholar at the Free Market Institute here at Texas Tech and an emeritus professor of economics at Florida State University. He's also the author of numerous books on the private provision of law and order, which relates to our topic today. Bruce, welcome to Tech and welcome to the show.
Oh, happy to be here.
So, on the first part of the show, we heard about how murder rates weren't, much higher in the West than they were in the East, but, there still were murders that occurred and stuff, and you're beyond the reach of government in many places. People have this, what about the vigilantes? They just hang people when they thought they were guilty. This doesn't seem like law and justice to me.
First of all, they pretty much knew that the individual was guilty before they hung them, but they were typically organized citizens groups, usually with the leading citizens in the community at the head, who were reacting to government failure to actually create law and order. In San Francisco, for instance, at the beginning of the gold rush, it was a relatively peaceful place, had a sheriff, and it was functioning fairly well. But then the gold rush just flooded the city with thousands and thousands of people. The local police sheriff was overwhelmed, and crime went up.
This sounds like a common criticism of kind of self-ordering communities, that when they're a small, kind of homogeneous group, everybody can use reputations to get along. And now this gold rush comes, flooded with thousands of new people, and chaos breaks out.
Well, it did, and because the government, as established, was unable to deal with it. But then when you get a group of citizens, very large group, 3,000 or so, who organized as a vigilance committee, they were in a position to ostracize. They would meet the boats coming from Australia, for instance, the criminal colonies in Australia, and check their paper. If they didn't have a signed a document from the U.S. representative in Australia giving them permission to come to the States. They wouldn't let them off the boats. They would confront people who were causing problems. If they were from Australia and didn't have papers, they told them to leave. They did not immediately hang people. One instance, for instance, where an individual was caught robbing a store, and he beat the store owner. He was caught and taken to the vigilante committee. The committee appointed 2 local attorneys to represent him, held a trial with a jury. He was found guilty, and in that case, of course, the statute in California at the time was you got hung if you were found guilty of robbery. So they did hang him. But another case, the jury voted 9-3 for guilty. It wasn't unanimous, so they let the guy go. It was very orderly, and that committee, I think, did hang 4 people in the course of a year or so.
So what gave this vigilance or vigilante committee authority? Who granted it to them?
I would say it was government by the people. The community backed them very strongly. In fact, when they put their announcement of the formation of the committee in the local newspaper, all of the people who were part of the committee put their name there, so everybody knew who they were. And the only opposition was the political establishment, which felt like they were getting cut out of the process. They were very popular. They really took control of the town, but then once violence declined, murders went from about 100 a year down to less than 10. Robberies went way down. They patrolled. A big problem in San Francisco's fires. So they patrolled to prevent arson. Fires went way down. Once things got under control, they just disbanded.
Why didn't they just become government themselves and start extracting, if we can't call it taxes, tribute, like a mafia boss or something from the city?
That's an interesting question that many historians are amazed at. Most of the vigilante groups simply restored peace and let go of power. The one reason, of course, was that these were merchants. These were people who had a living to make, and very lucrative living in many cases. You'd much rather be out mining gold than patrolling the streets. If the politicians, as they took over, of course, did mine the population through taxation, and so they were making their money in a different way, and they would certainly resist the loss of power. But the vigilantes themselves were private citizens who just wanted order so they could get on with business.
So this is an example, right, where the surge of population just swamped what government could do. But you've mentioned this kind of tension between the local government and the vigilantes. Mm-hmm. Are there other places where it's been more of a direct confrontation between them?
There's. I could talk more about San Francisco, where the next vigilante movement was in response to a tremendously corrupt government. But let me move to my own state, home state of Montana. The vigilante movement in Montana arose in the mining camps this time. The largest single discovery of gold, placer gold, was in Montana. Virginia City. Bannock was another gold camp. The individual who was elected sheriff of Bannock, who also got himself, through his political connections, appointed as the U.S. Marshal for the territory, also happened to be the leader of a gang of robbers. They called themselves the Innocents because it was so large a gang that they had to signal each other to announce that they were part of the gang, and their phrase typically was something like, "I am innocent." Well, that would tell the other guy that they were part of the gang. Anyway, this Henry Plummer was his name, the sheriff, and they were robbing gold shipments, stagecoaches, individual miners. When the sheriff is the leader of the gang, you can't really count on the sheriff to do much to help you protect your wealth and your lives. So a vigilante committee arose initially in Bannock. They captured a couple of thieves, and they were captured in the act, so they were hung. They were told, however, by one of these early individuals who was captured that, in fact, the leader of the operation was the sheriff. And so when word got out to the sheriff and his deputies, who happened to also be in the gang, they tried to take off and were hunted down. They were taken back to Bannock and probably appropriately hung on the gallows that the sheriff had built himself.
So you'd argue that much of the vigilante groups that were formed were in response to either government failure or government corruption.
Yeah, and of course one problem with this word vigilante is that it has been redefined. It comes from the base word vigilant or watchful. Its root is from the term watchman. And the definition now always includes something about the use of going outside the law and using violence to solve problems. So that lumps in, mobs, lynch mobs, the lynch mobs in the South that hung thousands of African Americans. Those were not vigilante groups trying to restore order. Those were lynch mobs. And so when you lump them all together, it sounds like a bad thing. But in the West, they weren't lynch mobs.
So we got like 1 minute left here. I want to return to our theme of the wild, wild West here for the last minute. If the vigilante groups were partly preserving order, and our first guest talked about all the different institutions that evolved to produce order. Maybe this Wild West notion comes from the conflict with the Native Americans and the settlers, and that's what made the West wild. What do you think about that?
Well, there certainly was conflict between the Native Americans. There was conflict between Native Americans, of course, before the Anglo-Americans arrived. They were, if you want to think of the tribes sort of like nations, they weren't nations, but there were wars between them, just like there are wars between nations today. They also, however, internally had peaceful, orderly lives through their own institutions for dispute resolution and so on to avoid violence internally.
I think that's a great point that maybe we could follow up again on another show. But thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
My guests today have kind of dispelled the notion that the West was so wild. Instead, they've described all sorts of ways that people beyond the reach of government found ways to create rules and enforce those rules so that they could have beneficial orders that would allow them to be better off. This, in the context of the Western frontier in the 19th century, is very encouraging. Maybe it makes me a little bit more encouraged that people outside the reach of government today would be able to order their affairs as well. Thanks for watching.